I have a Minolta MD 135mm f3.5 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. This lens is actually very similar to the Minolta Celtic 135mm f3.5. Except for the branding externally, they are quite similar in how they look, and then internally in their construction they're similar as well, which is a little bit disappointing because this is the regular MD lens. And the Celtic line was known for using cheaper components, and this MD version also uses those same cheaper components, the cheaper design decisions, a lot of plastic and other things that just cheapen the lens and make it less repairable. A lot of the parts are really integrated together, so that is going to limit how much it can be repaired and taken apart. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens and getting access to the diaphragm, optics, mechanical components, and the body sections on their own as much as possible. As I mentioned, a lot of these things are integrated together, but hopefully I can get them to a state where it can at least be repaired. I'm going to start off by getting access to the front of the diaphragm blades by going in on the front of the lens here, and on the name ring around here I'm going to undo that and remove the front optics as well. The name ring is the only thing holding in the front optics, so it's very easy to get access to the diaphragm. And the name ring has two little divots for a spanning wrench here and here, so you can use a pointed tip spanning wrench to undo the name ring. Now, much like on the Celtic, the front optics just fall right out of place. It's a very similar construction in that, as with the Celtic, this is just a single large piece of glass and plastic, and there's no easy way to get access inside of these. So if there's fungus or anything inside of these elements, there's no way to take this component apart, the optics apart, and actually clean anything more than just the front two surfaces. But now I have access to the front of the diaphragm blades here, so these can be cleaned off. But I'm also going to get access to the back of the diaphragm blades as well. So flipping the lens over, first off I have to remove the mounting plate, which is going around here and is held in place by these 4 screws. Right, so now I can lift off the mounting plate here, and like on the Celtic, this is actually what has the mechanical coupling of the diaphragm to the stop-down lever to the diaphragm mechanism. So it's a very simple setup. Talk a little bit more about how this works on the reassembly, but it's both coupling the aperture control ring and the stop-down lever to the diaphragm lever in here. So the diaphragm itself is being controlled by this little lever right here. Next up I have the aperture control ring, which I'll just remove as well at this stage. It's going around here, and it has the aperture control curve over here as well. And there's a little ball bearing over on this side here. There's some grooves and a little ball bearing, so I'm just going to lift this off and be careful not to lose the ball bearing. Okay, so there's the ball bearing and the aperture control ring. And now I'll get access to the back of the diaphragm by removing the back glass here. You can see kind of far down inside the lens there's a silver ring and then these 3 screws going around here. So I'm going to undo these 3 and then lift off both the silver ring and the back optics for the lens. Alright, so that just comes right out. It's much like the front optics where the back optics are enclosed in plastic and cannot really be taken apart any further. But you can clean the 2 external surfaces. Now we have access to the back of the diaphragm blades and the front of the diaphragm blades as well. So these can be cleaned at this stage. And because the diaphragm mechanism is integrated into the inside of the focusing mechanism, there's not a whole lot of advantage to disassembling the lens further if you just need to clean the diaphragm. This is pretty much you can clean it in this stage pretty much as well as you can at later stages as well. Just a quick note, the way the diaphragm is being held in is much like on the Celtic lens. So up here in the front section, if I actually wanted to remove the diaphragm blades and clean them individually, what I would do is I need to remove this black plate that it is holding on the front of the diaphragm and holding the blades in place. And that's just held in place by the screws going around here. There's 3 little slotted screws, or 4 slotted screws going around here. And those are holding on this black plate, and once you remove these little slotted screws, you should be able to just lift off that plate and the blades will fall out of place. And it is a little bit more of a pain to reassemble these type of lenses where it's integrated into, where the diaphragm mechanism is integrated into the focusing mechanism, but it shouldn't be too bad overall. Just continuing on with the disassembly, I'm going to detach the actual intersection of the focusing mechanism and the diaphragm from the outside section here, so the main lens body and the focusing ring. So this is just held in place when you focus up and down on the lens. There's the intersection that moves up and down, and these two bars are limiting how far I can extend in and out in here. So I'm going to remove these two bars while it's focused here at 1.5 meters, which is the minimum focusing distance. And you don't really have to actually undo the screws fully for these. I'm just going to loosen them up, and then once I have them loosened up, the bar should just fall out of place. We'll do that on the other side as well. Now I can grab the top section here and just focus it past where it could go before. You can see the start of the coils here. And while this is still kind of in place, it just fell out at this point, I want to mark where it's actually coming out of the lens so I know where to reattach it. Right now it's at 1.5 on the setting here, and I made a little mark up here before, and I'll make a little mark down here so it's kind of over near the infinity, just using some pencil or something that can be easily removed. And here is the diaphragm mechanism itself with the intersection of the focusing ring. This is what's making, because this is all oily and has all the lubricant and stuff in here, removing this part of removing the diaphragm mechanism and the focusing mechanism doesn't, in my opinion, get you a whole lot for being able to clean the diaphragm. It does make it easier to actually, if you're going to take apart the diaphragm and clean the blades on their own, it does make that part a little bit easier. It just is a pain because you have to always worry about getting oil on the blades from the focusing mechanism. And the other part I have removed here is the focusing ring and the ring with the depth of field scale and the outside of the focusing mechanism here on the inside. Unfortunately, unlike the Celtic, I'm not really sure how to take these two apart. On the Celtic, you could loosen up a little stopper thing or a screw that was limiting the focusing and then actually unscrew these components, and I'm not sure if the same is true on this one because I couldn't find a screw on the exterior here to actually loosen up and undo these two components. But if there is debris down here, you can probably clean this somewhat safely. You just have to probably give it more time to dry out, since there are some places where water could collect or cleaning solution could collect, and maybe re-lubricate the focusing mechanism when you're putting it back together. So that has the disassembly of this lens, and as you can see, some of these components can be a little bit further taken apart, but overall this is it has very few components, this type of lens. Got the optics, the front and back optics here, and the mechanical components, such as, it's mainly in the mounting plate actually, that are doing the coupling into the diaphragm, and then the diaphragm mechanism itself, which is still a pretty large piece, and as I mentioned, you can clean the individual blades, but removing things like the lens hood here from the diaphragm is, I don't know the best way to do that because it has to go over the focusing section here. So it doesn't seem to be something that can be easily removed. And then the main lens body here, which again, it seems like you should be able to take this one more apart like on the Celtic, but I wasn't able to figure out how to actually do that. But overall, a lot of integrated components and a pretty simple design. Starting back on the reassembly now, I'll take the focusing piece here, the exterior focusing piece, and the diaphragm combined interior focusing piece, and just thread these two back together. And I kind of marked where these two had separated, so I got the little mark, let's see, here and then here. So because these coils are pretty large, it shouldn't be too hard to get them threaded back together. There we go. And now on this intersection, looking at the back, I want to couple it back together so that there's these two grooves that are cut in the sides, kind of square grooves, and then these ones with the 3 screws going around here that I just had loosened up before to remove these 2 bars. So we need to lock the intersection in place so that it moves up and down rather than just spinning around as it does currently. And get these lined up so that the bars can go in place. So the bar should be in front of these 3 screws, and I can just slide the each bar back in place. That. I'll do the same on the other side, and then just lock this down. Alright, so it should be focusing between the minimum focusing distance, 1.5, and, seems like I locked it in the wrong position here, so need to spin this around a little bit more. It was not focusing past around 2.5 meters, so halfway or so. Alright, so I'm going to spin this around. Now, having made an extra revolution here, I'll try locking this in place again, just on one side first. What I want to see is that it goes between the infinity here and the minimum focusing distance of 1.5. So now this seems like the right orientation. So I'll just lock these bars in place again. Next up, I'll get the back optics in place. And this has the silver washer that sits on top of it. It's easier to put this together on the outside of the lens. I'll get the washer in place first and then just thread in the 3 screws here. Alright, and now this is just going to go down into the lens, into these 3 screw holes here, and the little gap in the ring, the silver ring, should be over by the stop down lever on this side. Alright, and now I'll get the aperture control ring back in place. And the aperture control ring has the aperture control curve right over here, which is going to go into the long slot on the main lens body right here. So it's going to sit like this. It just will slide in place, but I have to get the little ball bearing in place as well. So it rests on the aperture control ring, kind of over by the curve in this little pocket here. So I'll get this in place. And it's going to be pressed up against the grooves right in here on the lens. So just get this lined up. There we go. And should be making the clicking sound as it moves back and forth. Finally, on the back of the lens, I have to get this mounting plate assembly back in place. And the mounting plate has it's what's actually coupling both the aperture control ring and the stop down lever into the diaphragm mechanism. So the diaphragm mechanism is controlled by this little bar right here, simply opens and closes it. And this post back here is actually what is going to go onto that bar and open and close the diaphragm. The 2 ways it can be controlled is directly with the stop down lever, which moves the post itself, and then with the aperture control ring. And the aperture control ring has this aperture control curve over here, which is going to press against this little post here on the black ring that also moves the bar that's coupling to the aperture control lever back and forth. So as this post moves along the curve, it will open and close the aperture. So to hook this back up, I need to get the post back here with this little fork on top of the post here, so that it can control it directly, and then this other little bar or post in front of the aperture control curve. And really the only thing I have to get coupled together is this one onto the silver lever down there, and everything else should line up properly after that. So I'm kind of holding it open and just lowered it onto the aperture control curve right there, and I'm going to stop that down so I can see a little better, make sure everything's coupled. But when I hit the stop down lever, it should open fully, and then when I'm just holding it in place, the aperture control ring should also control it. And now I'll lock this in place using the 4 screws going around on the back of the mounting plate. So that has the back reassembly complete. And just to complete the front reassembly here, it's very straightforward. I'm gonna just drop the front optical piece in here, make sure it's all flat down inside there. and then lock it in place using the name ring. And tighten that down using the spanning wrench. So that has the reassembly all complete. Can check that everything is working properly, focus between the minimum focusing distance and infinity, and that the aperture control ring and stop down lever both are working as expected. Overall, the lens is extremely similar to the Minolta Celtic. I almost wonder if they just took the Celtic name off and rebranded this lens and called it a regular MD because they're so similar. And that has its downsides definitely, because so many of the components are integrated into each other. It's not very repairable. You can definitely take things like the optics and get those out and clean the two surfaces, the front surface and the back surface of the optics, but you can't actually take them apart and repair them. So if there's fungus inside the optics themselves, no way to repair that. And the integration also makes things like repairing the diaphragm or cleaning the diaphragm a little bit harder than it really should be, because the diaphragm and the inner part of the focusing mechanism are a single piece. But you can certainly make limited repairs on this lens, just probably not anything too extensive.